Hello, I'm glad to have you with me today. This is Sir Jet for another episode of the History Lectures. Today, our lesson is about Cory Aquino's speech before the US Congress. Now, this is about EDSA Revolution and its effects on the Philippines and also in the world. Now, last time we talked about martial law. Now, the next thing that happened was the EDSA Revolution. So today, before we analyze the document, I want to present to you how EDSA Revolution transpired. There are three events that I want to talk to you or to focus on so that you can see why and how EDSA Revolution happened. Now, the first one is I will explain to you martial law, the context of martial law, how bad or how good martial law was. And the next thing would be the Ninoy Aquino assassination. Now, this is like a domino effect. And then the last domino would be the 1986 presidential election, which led to the EDSA Revolution. Alright? So, if you're ready, let's focus on our screen. And these are the three events that caused the EDSA Revolution to happen. And the EDSA Revolution changed the life here in the Philippines and in the world. And that's something that we Filipinos can be proud of. Now, you will see later why I am saying this. So let's begin with martial law. So as you remember from last meeting, Ferdinand Marcos declared martial law on September 21, 1972 because he wanted to stay in power longer than the 8 years that the Constitution at that time prescribed for presidents. And he also said that the country was chaotic. The country will fall into the hands of the communist rebels, so he's declaring martial law. Now, when he declared martial law, he is in essence abolishing the Third Republic and the rule book that goes with it. And in its place, he set up a new republic. So historians call this the Fourth Republic. Marcos calls this the Bagong Lipunan, or New Society in English. And it was a dictatorial government, especially in its beginnings, when Marcos abolished the Congress, and what he says would be the law automatically, no more debate, and the military would implement whatever he would say. Marcos, being so powerful at that time, because nobody can really stand up against him. If somebody stands up against him, the military would get rid of those people. And so Marcos jailed all his critics, including the most vocal one, Senator Benigno Aquino Jr., or otherwise known as Ninoy, popularly known as Ninoy. He is the husband of Cory Aquino, and he's the father of Chris Aquino. And he's the grandfather of Bim Bim. Anyway, so Ninoy was put in jail because he's always criticizing Marcos during the pre-martial law years. Marcos also abolished human rights. No more freedom of the press, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, etc. Because he doesn't want any opposition, any opinion that is against him. So if you write in the newspaper anything against the government, you would go to jail. If you speak anything against Marcos, you might be dead. If you hold a rally, then all of you will go to jail. So you cannot really express your opinion against the government. And that's the picture of martial law. And on the economic side, cronyism was the order. Now, what is crony or cronyism. A crony is a friend or a relative of Marcos. And he got favor from Marcos because Marcos confiscated or sequestered the businesses of his enemies, and he would turn over those businesses to his cronies. So for example, ABS-CBN, during the Third Republic, it was owned by the Lopez family. Now Ferdinand Marcos didn't like the owner of ABS-CBN, so he confiscated or sequestered the TV network, and he put Mr. Lopez in jail, and then he gave the network to a friend of his. I think the name was Mr. Benedicto. That guy ran the company as if it was his company. And not only ABS-CBN, there are many other companies that got sequestered by Marcos and given to cronies for them to own that business and make money out of those businesses. And of course, if somebody gives you a business out of the blue and you're suddenly earning millions of pesos because of that business, wouldn't you give some kind of thanksgiving reward or a token to the one who gave you the business? Now that's called kickback. So that's how cronyism works. Marcos would give companies to cronies, and the cronies would make money out of those companies, and Marcos of course would get some kind of token. And that's the economic order during that time. Just a few families or a few people controlled the economy. Now on the military side, the AFP got the largest chunk of the national budget. It's like a buko pie that you slice, and the largest slice would go to the AFP, the Armed Forces of the Philippines. Not to education, not to infrastructure, not to health or environment, but to the military. So that's a very big chunk of the national budget, so that the army or the armed forces can really wipe out the rebels, and there would be peace in the martial law regime. The US did not stop Marcos from declaring martial law because they themselves benefited from martial law. As I've mentioned in the last video, the US hated communism, and communism was spreading in the world at that time, making some small countries fall into the hands of communist rebels, and the US didn't want that to happen to the Philippines. So if Marcos is like declaring an all-out war versus the communists through martial law, then the US would say amen to that. And also, there were US bases in the Philippines. Clark and Subic at that time were military bases. Clark was a giant parking lot of warplanes, and Subic was a giant parking lot of warships. If these places would continue to exist in the Philippines, then the US would have a very strategic launching pad for the defense of the Pacific from communism. Marcos would like to have these bases stay, and so the US would like Marcos to also stay some more in power, because if the next president would be anti-US, then goodbye Clark and Subic. So the US really would like Marcos to stay some more. And there were also US companies operating here in the Philippines, and they're making money out of the Filipino consumers. So if the next president, or if the country would fall in the hands of communists, then the US companies might be evicted. So as long as Marcos is in power and communism is out of the picture, the US would really benefit from that scenario. So that's the reason why martial law continued during the Fourth Republic. So that was the context. That's how life was in the 70s, alright, and early 80s. Now, the next event that happened was the Ninoy Aquino assassination. So in 1983, Benigno Aquino, the #1 critic of Marcos, was shot in the airport. Now, what was he doing in the airport? I thought Marcos put him in jail because Ninoy Aquino developed a heart disease while in prison. And so Marcos allowed him to go to the United States to have a heart operation. And after the heart operation, Ninoy was making a return to the country. And as you can see in the picture, that's him inside the airplane. And when the airplane landed, some soldiers came in to arrest him and bring him back to prison. And of course, there were media men covering the arrest of Ninoy inside the plane because he's a celebrity and everybody's curious about Marcos's #1 enemy. There was some cameramen and some soldiers arresting Ninoy. And August 21 became a holiday. We call it Ninoy Aquino Day. No class, no work on this day. Okay, so when Ninoy was being led out of the airplane, the media men following him, were blocked by some soldiers. And the next thing that they heard was gunfire. And the cameramen tried to run to the windows of the plane to see where the gunfire was coming from. And what they saw on camera was this. Ninoy was already on the pavement with the blood coming from his head. And there's a guy wearing a sky blue shirt. And he is beside Ninoy. He's also dead. And the soldiers put the body of Ninoy inside that van and it sped off. And that's what happened on August 21. And that's 3 years after Ninoy had his heart surgery in the US. I was a little boy when that happened, and I saw the newscast that showed all these images. This is what happened. The military was claiming, okay, so in the newscast later that day, the guy in the blue shirt, this one, was the one who shot Ninoy as he stepped on the ground. He just darted from nowhere, approached Ninoy and shot him in the head. And so the soldiers shot him because he is the killer of Ninoy. And so we have 2 dead people on the pavement. But further investigation showed that Ninoy was actually on the 3rd or 4th step from ground zero. 1, 2, 3. So Ninoy was standing here, and there were soldiers on his right and on his left escorting him down, and there are soldiers behind him going down the stairs. And he was shot at this point, and then he fell to the ground. The funny thing here is that the autopsy report showed that Ninoy was shot point blank on the head. Point blank means it's not from long range, but it's short range. The gun is pointed directly on his head at close range, and the bullet entered Ninoy's back of the head near the left ear. Okay, so touch your left ear, behind your left ear, touch that area, and the bullet made its exit on the chin. Okay, put your other hand on your chin. So what is the trajectory of the bullet? Exactly, it's going down. So the shooter must be somebody on a higher level than Ninoy. And it couldn't be the guy in the blue shirt, because the guy in the blue shirt was on the ground. How can you shoot somebody who is 5 feet 10? Ninoy is 5'10". And he's standing on the 3rd step. So that would be around 3 feet plus 5'10". And the shooter is just, the guy in the blue shirt is 5 feet 4 inches. How can he shoot somebody and the trajectory is from the left ear to the chin if you are down here? So the mystery is that nobody saw the gunman. The military is just claiming that he's the gunman. And so the people were really very suspicious of the reports because it doesn't jibe with the autopsy report. Later on, the guy in the blue shirt had a name. They found the name, Rolando Galman. The military said he was standing at the bottom of the staircase. And the initial report that the media gave is that this guy, Rolando Galman, was an NPA and he is disguised as an airport janitor because this blue shirt is the uniform of the janitors of the airport. But later on, some investigators were able to identify that Rolando Galman was not an NPA and he's not an airport janitor, but he is somebody who is in jail for many cases. He is a criminal and he was in jail multiple times for multiple crimes. And maybe people say that he was just used as a fall guy, as props in the skit in the killing of Ninoy. And the public felt that Galman did not do it, but he's just standing there. Somebody shot Ninoy from behind his head, maybe somebody behind him in the stairs, and when Ninoy was shot, then they started shooting at the props, Rolando Galman, to make it appear that Galman was the shooter. And so the public was really intrigued, and they had rallies at that time calling for Marcos to have an investigation that is fair. And Marcos assembled an investigating committee to solve the case so that the people would somehow be appeased. This is the funeral of Ninoy. Okay? As you can see, lots and lots of people accompanying the coffin going to the cemetery. Now, the committee that Marcos established was able to convict the 15 escort soldiers. Okay, so I told you there were soldiers left and right of Ninoy and behind him. So the 15 soldiers with Ninoy went to jail. But the committee failed to identify the shooter and the mastermind. It's like a half-baked decision. The committee wouldn't or couldn't identify who among the 15 pulled the trigger, but they are sure it's one of the 15. So they sent the 15 to jail. The mastermind who ordered the 15 soldiers to kill Ninoy, they also failed to identify. Now, because of that half-baked justice, daily rallies happened to express the people's disgust. Rallies like this were a common sight every day in the TV and in newspapers. The people who were silent in the early days of martial law suddenly had the guts to stand up and complain against Marcos. That's why Ninoy Aquino was called the ama ng demokrasya. Because of him, people had the courage. Because of his death, people started coming out of the streets and holding rallies once again. Now, the US, seeing this happen in the next many months after the assassination of Ninoy, pressured Marcos to do something about the situation. Because in the US, their citizens were also expressing their disgust on the US government. US citizens are saying to their government, you know, our country, the US, is supposed to be the champion of democracy. But how come we are supporting a dictatorship in the Philippines? And so the American president at the time felt the pressure from his own people. So he talked to Marcos and told him, you better shape up the democracy image in your country because the world is looking at you and they don't want a dictatorship in Asia because you are identified as a US friend and the US is not supposed to support dictators but democracy. And so because of this, Marcos was pressured to declare a snap election in 1986. Now, when you say snap, that means it is out of schedule. He wanted to just tell the world that the Filipino people still love him, that the daily rallies that they see every day is not really a big deal. This is just a minority of the Filipino people, and that the big majority of the people still love him as president. So he said this 1986 snap election would prove that. Okay, so the election happened. There was a campaign period, and who ran against Marcos? The widow of Ninoy Aquino, Cory Aquino. It was a very colorful campaign. It's red versus yellow. That's why I'm wearing a red shirt today. And then the PowerPoint slide is yellow. So you will see the two sides of that election. If you're a Marcos supporter, you wear red. If you're a Cory supporter, you wear yellow. And then they have hand signals. What are the hand signals? If you are pro-Marcos, you do the victory sign. Okay? And then you shout, Marcos, Marcos, Marcos pa rin. Yeah, that's their chant. Now, if you're a Cory supporter, you do the L sign. Okay? L stands for Laban. That's the name of the political party of Cory, Laban. And you would shout, Sobra na, tama na, palitan na. Okay, so very, very animated and colorful campaign. And so the election happened on February of that year, February 7 to be exact. And you know, there was a landslide victory. Who won? Marcos, by a landslide. And many felt that he cheated. Even the COMELEC walked out at one point, because when they press something on the computer, the wrong numbers come up, and Marcos seems to be programmed as the winner whenever they press something or some data on the computer. So they walked out. Nonetheless, the government or the Congress, I think that it's called the Assembly at that time, okay? The Assembly proclaimed Marcos as the winner of the election. And everybody felt so bad, including the military. Not only the people felt bad about Marcos's victory in the election, but even his own men, the men who were loyal to him during martial law, didn't feel good about the result of the election. Specifically, the defense minister, Juan Ponce Enrile. Yes, the guy who was supposed to be, or who was supposedly ambushed, suddenly turned against Marcos. And the martial law administrator, the one who would do the arrests of Marcos's enemies, General Fidel Ramos. He was a 3-star general at that time, and AFP Vice Chief of Staff. So these two men, okay, that's Ramos and Enrile, plotted against Marcos. It's a secret plan to grab power. Since they controlled the military, there's a little faction, not too many actually, just around 300 soldiers who were with them, and they planned to grab power from Marcos. But Marcos had his own intelligence group, and they were able to discover the plan of these two men. And so they got information that there would be a coup attempt to grab power. So Marcos ordered the arrest of Ramos and Enrile. Now, Ramos and Enrile also had their own intelligence, and they were able to discover that their plan was already discovered. And so they prepared for the arrest. They went to Camp Crame and Camp Aguinaldo, that's their home base, that's their offices, and waited for the arresting teams. And they armed themselves, full battle gear, ready to fight the arresting teams. And so there was tension. They were afraid also for their lives. So Ramos and Enrile called some personalities to help them. The first one they called, of course, is Cory Aquino. And they called Cory. Cory, we are now against Marcos, believe it or not. They are going to arrest us. Would you like to help us? And Cory said, "Where? Really? You're against Marcos? You were the ones, and you're asking for my help? You were the ones who jailed Ninoy. And you were the ones who really gave me a big headache, me and my family, during the martial law period. And now you're asking for my help? I'm sorry. The most I can give you is my prayers." And so they didn't get any help from Cory. So they turned to other personalities. Boots Aquino, the brother of Ninoy, who was a politician at that time, opposition leader, and Cardinal Sin, the Catholic bishop, I mean cardinal, sorry. He's a cardinal, so cardinal is higher than the bishop. And these two people called on the Filipino masses to come out and surround Camp Crame and Camp Aguinaldo so that the arresting teams would not get Enrile and Ramos. They did this through radio. They made a broadcast on radio. Cardinal Sin, Boots Aquino, and then the people heard them. And since the people are Catholics mostly, okay, so they followed their Catholic leader. And the people also hated Marcos, so they also came out, okay, and followed what Cardinal Sin and Boots Aquino were asking them to do. So they formed human barricades around Camp Aguinaldo and Camp Crame, and these two camps are along EDSA, the big road going to Cubao. So they massed up there to protect Enrile and Ramos. And as you can see, so many people blocking the way. The tanks that are supposed to come and arrest Ramos and Enrile were blocked. Okay? And they cannot get to Camp Crame and Camp Aguinaldo. And instead, they joined the crowd. The soldiers inside the tanks, when they saw the crowd, their hearts melted. And then they joined the crowd. They became anti-Marcos. And so Marcos would send another batch of tanks. And the same thing would happen. The soldiers in the tanks would see all those people against Marcos, and they would also join the crowd. The people would be shouting, "Sumama na kayo, join! Sumama na kayo, join! Wag matakot, makibaka!" And then they would join the crowd until all the tanks and all the soldiers sent by Marcos to get Ramos and Enrile turned over to the side of the people. And nobody or no soldier, no military unit is on the side of Marcos anymore, except the most loyal general, the 4-star general, General Fabian Ver. What would you do if the people are not following you? The military is no more because they are not on your side anymore. Marcos left the country. That was on the 4th day of the revolution, the mass up on EDSA, February 25 to be exact. And it's a holiday today. Every February 25, no work, no school. And Marcos was actually rescued by the Americans because the people might get Marcos, mob him in Malacanang. So the Americans sent helicopters to fetch Marcos from Malacanang and evacuated him to Hawaii. That's a US soil. And Cory became the next president. This is Cory in her oath-taking. And the people now have democracy restored. No more martial law. And they have a president. And some say Cory got into that position because of a free ride. Because Enrile and Ramos started it, and the one who benefited the most is Cory Aquino. Now it's up for you to decide on that. Okay? You will read the document later on. Now, after the EDSA Revolution, the world was so amazed on how a bloodless revolution could happen in the Philippines. Imagine, there was not a single casualty in the EDSA Revolution. Nobody died, nobody got wounded. and then there is a change of power. There's a change of government from dictatorship to democracy. Change of leader from Marcos to Cory. And this happened, technically a revolution, but no bloodshed. First time in the history of the world. And the world was really looking at the Philippines at that time, admiring us, the Filipino people. And the US Congress invited Cory to speak before them about the EDSA Revolution. And Cory obliged to their invitation, and there she is in front of the US Congress delivering the speech. Alright? So this is Sir Jet saying, see you around.